So I've been reading Plotinus, and it's got me thinking a lot about the nature of God in Platonism. And, it's very common to hear Platonists say things like that, God is this impersonal thing. It's the one. It's beyond essence, beyond being. It's more of a principle than anything else. And then a lot of those attributes that we would traditionally think of as being God get ascribed to the demiurge or the craftsman of the universe. And I find it interesting that in Plotinus, and especially in the Middle Platonists before them, that this idea of a very distinct difference between the one and the craftsman of the universe, it's not always there. And I think this causes a great amount of confusion. Like today, we make a bigger deal of the difference between the one and the demiurge than was made in ancient times. The Middle Platonists weren't necessarily making this big of a distinction, and even Plotinus in some cases wasn't making as big of a distinction of this. And let me give you an example. Reading Aeneid 1:1, to be specific, and Plotinus says, we have the forms then in two ways, in the soul in a way unfolded and separated, but in intellect altogether. But how are we related to God, he asks. And there's a great footnote to that question that says here, God refers to the one or the good. Elsewhere, God refers to intellect. The one is above ousia, essence. So right here in Plotinus, we can see that sometimes when Plotinus is saying the word God, he means the one or the good. And other times when he's saying God, he means the intellect, which traditionally in Middle Platonic thought, the intellect is equated with the demiurge. The demiurge is the intellect itself. And let me give you another example of this. The Middle Platonists, it's a great book if you want to learn more about them. But Numenius in particular, there's a great chapter in this book about the first principles and this idea of the Father and the demiurge. And Numenius starts to make this differentiation between the Father, which isn't really the Platonian one yet, but he's starting to make the separation to say that there's the Father who is kind of like the demiurge of being itself, and then there's the traditional demiurge we think of as like the craftsman or creator of the universe. And so it's interesting that we start to see this separation of like the first God and the second God, and Numenius even has like a third God that's kind of like creation itself. And in this book, they make a point to say, though, that on balance, there's a quote here, quoting, on balance, however, the first God is for Numenius a nous of some sort, an intellect of some sort. So that we do not find in him the unequivocal placing of the supreme principle above nous that we find in Plotinus. So for Numenius, one of the Middle Platonists, and this goes for a lot of the Middle Platonists, they didn't necessarily conceive of God as this like beyond being type of one that Plotinus is talking about. That really is like one of the unique things to Plotinus, is he finally starts to develop this very apophatic understanding of the one. But for the Middle Platonists, what you really see is something more like there's a first intellect, a first God, and then a second God. And so they kind of are starting to separate these ideas, but not quite. And even in the Middle Platonists, there's a bit of a murky connection, I guess, between them, or like they're not as separated even in the Middle Platonists. It's like they they're making a distinction, but that distinction isn't always to say that these things are completely separate. Like in here, this is page 372 in the Middle Platonist book, the notion of proskresis is not easy to comprehend. It presumably means that the first God is only an active intellect insofar as he communes with the second, that's the second God, even as the second God, Numenius says, is only actively demiurgic insofar as he communes with the third. And so it's like these gods are all interconnected, and it's not like they're wholly separate things. And in that sense, I think what starts to make sense once we get to Plotinus is something that Eric Pearl points out in Thinking Being, which is that things that the one as being something that's transcendent is fundamentally related and intertwined with what is immanent, meaning everything that comes after that. So like from the intellect, the nous, to the soul, to all materiality, all of that we could look at as the immanent. Anything that's in being, right, is immanent. And then the one is beyond being. But those two things exist in this kind of dual aspect unity that you can't have one without the other. And, in order for something to be transcendent, in order for the one to be transcendent, there needs to be something that's immanent, that it transcends, right? And in order for something to be immanent, there needs to be this first cause that transcends it, that provides it its own being. And so Plotinus puts this in a really clever way when he describes the one as being the productive power of all things. It really shows the interrelationship between those things. It's not, they're not these completely disconnected things. And so all of that to circle back to this idea about God. So when I say God, and I think when the Platonists, the Middle Platonists, and even to some, and obviously actually with Plotinus, when he says God, sometimes he's talking about the one, and sometimes he's talking about the intellect, the nous, the demiurgic God. And those terms are very often used somewhat interchangeably. As much as we recognize that the demiurge it's something unique and distinct from the first principle in the one, we also recognize that we're kind of talking about the same thing. And I think this gets to the heart of the kind of dual aspect monism that Platonism is really centered around. It's been a hard thing to grasp because it's easy to think that Platonism is just monism. And I had somebody recently I was talking to who really, really thought that Platonism was dualistic as well. And you get kind of both sides of that from people, depending on who you're talking to and what sources you're listening to. You might think that the one is monistic or that Platonism is monistic or that Platonism is dualistic. But in point of fact, it's a bit of both. And the best thing that we can describe it as is something like non-dualism or dual aspect monism. And it really relates to this understanding that we have of God, that God does have this aspect of being beyond being, but we also recognize that God is also the intellect. God is also the craftsman of the universe. That's another way that we look at God. And all of that to say, I think a lot of Platonists today put too big of a wedge between those two things and try to act like they're very, very separate. And I think part of the reason is because of Christianity. Maybe all of the reason, actually, is because of Christianity. Because Christians effortlessly blend these two ideas together. I was listening to Bishop Barron talk about this, and he was talking about what God really is. And it's funny how he described it, because he does something that Alcinous does as well in the Handbook of Platonism, which is he describes God as beyond being. and the sort of source of being. He's like, that's what God is. God is beyond being, totally transcendent. And, he's what causes being. It's the cause of being. And then not 30 seconds later, he then says, and God is being itself. And it's like, those are two different things, right? The cause of being is not its effect, right? The cause of being is not being itself. These are two distinct things. And yet, in a 2-minute clip, he manages to describe God as being both of those things, right? Which being is the same as thinking, which is to say, being is the intellect, is the nous, right? So right there, we get this same idea of blending these two things together. And I think it's just a common theological necessity. I mean, I even see the same trend in Hinduism too, where, you could look at Brahman as like the formless, absolute, ultimate reality, which is akin to the one. But there's also Ishvara, and Ishvara is God in the traditional sense. I think Ishvara literally means Lord. And oftentimes when Hindus are saying the word God, that's kind of what they mean is Ishvara, but they also kind of mean the ultimate reality in Brahman as well. And so it's a little bit of both. And all of that to say, I think it's a common feature to do this in theology and in religion, is to have some understanding that, yes, there is this ultimate reality of God that is, beyond our comprehension and is impersonal, just the same way that Brahman is impersonal. Christians wouldn't necessarily say that the ineffable aspect of God is impersonal, although it's hard to justify that it is a person. But I think the way we get away with this, or the way it really makes sense, is that there is this ineffable, impersonal aspect of God in the transcendent one, or Brahman, or whatever you want to call it. But then there is the personal aspect of God that is in being, that is in the intellect, in the nous, or is the demiurgic intellect, the creator, craftsman of the universe, the lawgiver, that we end up seeing in the figure of Jupiter as the father, the king and father of gods and men, craftsman of the universe. And so it's both. And I hope Platonism is able to start to move past this kind of reactionary distaste for the idea of a personal God, and constantly pushing it to be like, no, God is this totally impersonal thing. And, we're doing ourselves a disadvantage by not recognizing that, as far as the Middle Platonists go, and even reading Plato himself, I mean, read the Timaeus, and there's very much a sense that there's a personal aspect to God, and there's the impersonal as well. But there's a unity to both of those. And I think the Platonists understood that intuitively. And yet today, we tend to draw a bigger wedge there where there probably doesn't need to be one. That's the thought for today.